Rome both is and isn't a football town. The people who live there might be crazy about the sport, but the clubs who also live there aren't really that successful at the sport. For a brief window in the late 90s and early 2000s though, that changed. This is a story about when Rome ruled Italy. In a football sense, of course, but only too briefly. As the TV theme song says, Golazzo. And I'm not the only one who thought that. It's what it said as a kid. Giorgio Vaccaro ran the club in its early days. Nice guy, Giorgio, in charge of the FIGC and also a massive fascist. Unfortunately for him, his good old pal Benito Mussolini fancied a bit of the football too and set up Roma in 1927. And it was their friendship that was the only thing keeping Lazio from being swallowed up. So now we've got that checkered history out of the way. Lazio were a club that challenged for honours early on in their lifespan, largely in the 1910s. However, it wasn't until Silvio Piola was acquired in 1934 that the club really got going. Not that it meant much by way of any silverware. You've got to zoom forward all the way through to 1958 and its Coppa Italia final when Lazio defeated Fiorentina that the Biancocelesti won their first major honour. Then came the 1970s, which were a bit wild, to be honest. Tommaso Maestrelli was made coach, a man who was still a young manager that had worked his way up through Bari, Regina and Foggia before being hired by the second-tier Lazio in 1971. There was no cash injection that boosted the club into being a big name, just sheer hard work, both on and off the pitch, which usually resolved itself in a bit of a punch-up. Maestrelli tapped into his contact books from Foggia to sign a few players, won promotion back to Serie A in 1972. This was nothing out of the ordinary. Lazio were a yo-yo club for all intents and purposes. The one thing that suggested this would be slightly different was Giorgio Canaglia, who was pumping goals in left, right and centre, so much so that he became the first Serie B player to be capped by the national team. 21 goals in the promotion season became 24 goals in the Capocannoniere in the 73-74 campaign. The Italian was good in front of goal and, as it turned out, handy in a brawl, as Roma found out in a nasty derby around this time. During a fight, and there's lots of these in this era, Canaglia ran around an Olimpico bloated to over twice its capacity to goad all of the Roma fans after a Lazio win. They had their best season in the 1972-73 season, but chucked in the Scudetto on the final day thanks to a loss in Naples. Previously, they would have frittered away, but again, these were different times. Playing a style that has been erroneously likened to Dutch total football, Lazio swept through Serie A in the subsequent campaign, winning their first title. But how did Lazio do in the European Cup as champions? Well, actually they were banned because of a mass brawl, typically, in their UEFA Cup elimination against Ipswich Town. Basically, the Tractor Boys had slaughtered them 4-0 in Suffolk with a mix of ingenuity and a spot of poor officiating. Back in Rome, Ipswich squeaked through amid the ferocious atmosphere that led to pitch invasions, fistfights, and the English team being locked in their dressing room for 2 hours after the match. This Lazio were a product of their time. Their football glittered, but their fights garnered the headlines as the 70s wore on for more tragic reasons. Manager Tommaso Maestrelli died from cancer in December 1976. He had returned to the club after treatment for his terminal cancer failed, the club bottom, and he rescued them from relegation. Such was Maestrelli, a father figure. It was Canaglia's dying wish to be buried next to Maestrelli, and he did so in 2012, his body flown from America back home. Maestrelli is one of the biggest legends in Lazio history. He even rejected the national team after their limp 1974 World Cup exit. Such was his love for Lazio. Tragedy unfortunately followed this club around. One of their players, Luciano Riccicone, died in January 1977 after he was shot playing a joke on a jeweller who thought he was trying to rob him. Since Maestrelli was one of the only things keeping a violent and erratic squad together, it's no surprise that they went back down in 1980. However, their method of relegation is a bit of a shock to say the least. Even though it was by far a landmark season for Lazio, on the pitch they would have narrowly avoided relegation ahead of Catanzaro by just a point, but they were demoted anyway. They had gotten themselves enveloped in the Tottenero betting scandal that also claimed the season of Milan, also demoted to Serie B, and so kick-started another doom spiral of yo-yoing until Lazio's final promotion in 1988, where they were effectively saved from bankruptcy. The man from Del Monte, he said, "I'll buy Lazio." So he did in 1992. Sergio Cragnotti, months before Paul Gascoigne had been signed from England, promised to deliver Lazio back into the big time. Italian football was spending big bucks, and Lazio with Cragnotti thought, let's just do that as well. He rose to prominence through suicide politics and scandal. He was moneyed and decided to spend all of it and more, and not necessarily all his own, on footballers. So, an all-round fucking stellar bloke then. Lazio were floated on the stock exchange, which was a first in Italy, and their training ground was rebuilt with almost €100 million worth of players spent initially. That's a quick reminder that this is not adjusted for inflation, this is early 1990s money. All his money on players: Gaza, Beppe Signori, Aaron Winter, Alan Boksic, Pierluigi Casaraghi, Roberto Di Matteo, Pavel Nedved, Vladimir Jugovic, Roberto Mancini, Marco Devau, Alan Boksic again, Mateus Almeida, which didn't even particularly get them anywhere in an ultra-competitive league. Until Sven-Göran Eriksson, a Swedish coach who had won the lot and in multiple countries too, and he even had tasted a flavour of Rome beforehand when he managed the club across the road. It was seen as quite the coup for Cragnotti, since Sven had a deal effectively struck with Blackburn Rovers. Again, it was a very different time this. Now armed with a decent manager, the spending went from exorbitant to batshit. Christian Vieri, Marcelo Salas, Sinisa Mihailovic, Dejan Stankovic, Sergio Conceição and Fernando Couto. Yes, that's one summer and it's well over €100 million. It's still the 20th century as well, by the way. So what do they get for their money? They win the last edition of the Cup Winners' Cup against Mallorca and qualify for the Champions League. Not bad. They didn't win the league, but still not bad. Except they were a staggering 7 points clear at the top of Serie A with 6 matches to play, and they utterly bottled it. The team that began this downward spiral, of course, Roma, as they beat them 3-1. Lazio were in a bad way, not helped by their ultras intimidating players after the game had finished. Also, red cards for Sinisa Mihailovic and Alessandro Nesta late on ruled them out of the crucial tie with Juventus. And this only triggered another defeat by the same scoreline 6 days later, before a draw in Florence on the penultimate match day put the nail in the coffin. After heartbreakingly losing the title to Milan on the final day, the question was, could Lazio go again? But hold on, what about their beloved roommates? Roma, the bigger supported club in the capital and marginally more successful. They were formed in 1927 when Benito Mussolini tried to encapsulate all the capital into one huge homogeneous beast. Lazio didn't heed the call, but nonetheless, Roma were instantly the biggest show in town. William Garbutt oversaw the early days, but he was long gone by the time Roma reached their peak in the 1940s. Led by Fulvio Bernardini and Amedeo Amadei, they could only win the wartime title of 1942, unfortunately. They were the first team from the south to win the title, but of course rumours about Mussolini's hand in the triumph perpetuated. They were shockingly relegated to the second tier for their one and only season in the 1951-52 campaign, and rebounded to have the most malnourished of heydays in the 60s. Included within were a couple of Coppa Italia triumphs and a European trophy, even if it was the Fairs Cup against Birmingham City. It wasn't until the 80s arrived that Roma had a team to be proud of. Niels Lidholm, of Milan fame both as a player and manager, is parachuted into the underachieving capital club who are merely existing and doing so even in the shadow of Lazio. It's a team led by Agostino Bartolome and Robert Pruzzo's goals up front and featured probably the most famous names in Bruno Conte, Falcao, not that one, and Carlo Ancelotti, yes, that one. It's a team that must be said was bought by Dino Viola and transformed both on and off the pitch. They had gone from no hopers to Coppa Italia winners in 1980, and yet the season after had a bitter taste in the mouth. And that's because of crooked refereeing and, naturally, Juventus. After that Coppa winning season, Roma were robbed of the Scudetto. Picture the scene, 3 matches to go, the gap between Roma and Juve is a point. And Maurizio Torroni scores a late winner for Roma against their title rivals, only for a whistle to go to disallow the goal for offside. It is a ghost goal remembered as one of the finest displays of corruption and blatant cheating in Italian football, which is certainly saying something in Italy. But Roma, like Lazio the previous decade, bounced back from this adversity. Niels Lidholm still had something to prove despite winning a Scudetto with Milan in '79. Could he do it in the capital? 3 years later they win the league for only the second time, and despite Juventus curating a team that features such legends as Zoff, Gentile, Boniek and Platini. It is a campaign turned around by the return of often crocked Carlo Ancelotti. After cruelly missing Italy's World Cup celebrations that summer, he kicks the Giallorossi on with his instrumental form. Known for their propensity to keep it tight away and dazzle at home, Roma get that Scudetto on their shirt. This in a competitive league bolstered by the enticing promoted clubs Sampdoria and Hellas Verona, who would both win the title within a decade, as well as, of course, the more traditional names. If they had been thwarted by kind Juventus officiating in 1981, Roma were helped out themselves on May 1st, 1983, when Juve fans shot themselves in the foot, or rather, they bricked a coach window carrying Inter players, which resulted in a walkover victory for the Nerazzurri. It left Roma a point away from the title, and that was achieved in typical fashion away to Genoa. Buoyed by the historic campaign, seemingly with fate on their side, Roma immersed themselves in a first European Cup campaign, with the final to be played in their own backyard. They, of course, make the showpiece event, even if it was slightly fortunate that they were there at all. Trailing 2-0 from a semi-final first leg with, yes, you guessed it, Dundee United, the referee for the second leg in Rome, Michel Vatreau, was paid £50,000 to allow Roma through to the final. However, this was no ordinary bribe. The ref never got the money. Roma had players booked and therefore suspended for the final and had 2 goals disallowed. Yet they still went through, winning 3-0. Their winning penalty isn't particularly dodgy, so what kind of strange 1984 bribery is this? Nonetheless, they hold their own by taking the almighty Liverpool to penalties where, unfortunately for Roma, the spaghetti-legged Bruce Grobbelaar thwarts them from 12 yards. Amid fighting between Italian and English hooligans and rumours about why Falcao didn't even take a penalty, Niels Lidholm's tenure was officially over. That man Sven-Goran Eriksson inserts himself into the piece again, as he often did, and his reign is less glorious. There are Coppa Italia wins again in 1986 and 91, as well as a UEFA Cup final loss to Giovanni Trapattoni's Inter, but they are one of the lesser ranked Seven Sisters of Calcio. In the 1990s, they'd never break into the top 3, and despite excitement such as Francesco Totti's debut and the legendary Zdenek Zeman in charge, Roma just aren't successful. They can't even beat Lazio for a handful of years, but at least it was fun. They top scored in both the 97-98 and 98-99 seasons. But as the new millennium was upon us though, things start to get serious for both teams in Rome. It's summertime and it's Lazio, so what do you think they do? They spend and spend. Yet it isn't Lazio causing the uproar and criticisms from the epitome of calm, cool collection known as Vatican City. It's Inter, who priced Christian Vieri from Lazio for €30 million. It kicks off another mad dash through just another summer in Italian football as Diego Simeone walks down that same path as part of the aforementioned deal. Joining him at the Olimpico was Simone Inzaghi, as well as Simeone's compatriots Juan Sebastian Veron and Nestor Sensini. It's time to party. It is Lazio's centenary year after all, and the Biancocelesti have brought the tools ready to do so. What a time it would be to go and win the title for only their second time in their history. It's not hyperbole to say that Lazio and their supporters had suffered a trauma in the 1998-99 season. Thankfully, the sheer volume of transfers revolving through the doors at the Olimpico ought to have offset any ill effects. The season could barely have started off any better. A trophy was won, and against the treble winners Manchester United in the UEFA Super Cup as well. Their freshly knighted manager Sir Alex Ferguson declared that Lazio would win Serie A that season, and with unbeaten form that saw Parma picked off away from home and points gleaned from matches against both Milan clubs before November turned up, it was hard to argue against. They'd opened October up against the former reigning champions Milan and went toe-to-toe with them in the most un-Italian way possible, a 4-4 draw. Not only did they show attacking prowess, they showed the resolve that was lacking towards the back end of the prior season, when Marcelo Salas nullified Andrei Shevchenko's hat-trick with a late equaliser. It wasn't all sunshine, as Parma players, including Lilian Thuram, were racially abused in Lazio's home ground. It marked a mid-season slump both on and off the field that would continue to be a cloud for Lazio supporters who aren't complete dickheads. This slump was efficiently emphasised by a 4-1 loss to Roma in the derby, where both Marco Del Vecchio and Vincenzo Montella tore Lazio apart with 4 goals in 24 minutes. Almost 4 months to the day, Lazio licked the wounds of another defeat, this time away to Hellas Verona, which all but spelled the end of their title race. With 8 matches to go, Lazio trailed Juve by 9 points and would need a stumble the like of which we hadn't seen for, well, about a year since Lazio's 1999 vintage. Roma in the reverse fixture of the derby was exactly the wrong game at exactly the wrong time, especially when Vincenzo Montella scored after 3 minutes. When he wasn't acting like this was a simulation of Championship Manager 0102, Lazio hit back and found their way in front via Pavel Nedved and Juan Seba Veron, until the derby devolved into typical means, a royal capital rumble. Regardless, Lazio held out for the win, and with Juve next in Turin, they could shave the deficit from 9 points to 3 in a matter of 7 days. Ciro Ferrara's red card changed the entire complexion of the title race, and just moments later, Diego Simeone nodded in to claim all 3 points against Juve. Perugia, normally the kiss of death for title-winning teams, the Italian equivalent to Tenerife in the 90s for Classico clubs. They were dispatched too, thanks to one of just 2 Serie A goals scored by Attilio Lombardo for Lazio. It was all going so well, too well, as Lazio looked to reduce the deficit even further 6 days later in Florence. They led 3-2 thanks to an 89th minute Sinisa Mihailovic penalty and appeared home and hosed. Then, Gabriel Batistuta did Batigol things, and his stoppage time free kick appeared to end all Lazio hopes for good. 4 to play with 5 points the difference, it was all set to be an almighty struggle. Another kingmaker, however, put a spanner in Juve's works when Hellas Verona beat them 2-0 at the Bentegodi. Pressure off, Lazio kept winning increasingly tense matches, away to Piacenza and Bologna, as well as at home to Venezia. As Lazio snuck their latest win away in Bologna, Juve hosted Parma. Alessandro Del Piero had netted on the hour mark, and the title race was going down to the wire whatever way you could spin it. Then Fabio Cannavaro headed in. Cheers went up in the capital. The teams were due to be neck and neck for the final day. And then the referee blew up for reasons barely understood today. It was over the line, there was no offside, no foul, but the goal would not be allowed to stand. May 7th, 2000 or May 10th, 1981, the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. Juventus were fucking a team from the capital out of a Scudetto. That's what the conspiracies say, and in light of Calciopoli in 2006, it's hard to make a case for Juve. Cragnotti moaned that Lazio deserved the title on moral grounds, but on the final day, they were massive underdogs, trailing Juve as they did by 2 points. Regardless, the old lady still had to go to Perugia and get something to win the title. Perugia were the kindest opposition, on paper at least. They were a low-ranking Serie A side that weren't spectacular, but crucially, they were safe from relegation. Lazio had similar foes, Regina, who were only a point ahead of Perugia. Lazio rattled off their 3 points with 2 penalties before the half-time break, a win completed by a third goal courtesy of Diego Simeone before the hour mark. All that was left to do was to plant ear to transistor radio and pray for news from Perugia. Except that game was delayed by excessive rainfall. Lazio fans could already sense another screw job coming. A point for Juventus, as was the case when their second half kicked off, would have kicked the season into a final playoff for the title, given Serie A's rules. Except that wasn't going to happen. Alessandro Calori wrote himself into Lazio folklore, despite his career never even coming close to a pit stop in the capital. The 33-year-old defender scored the goal that won Perugia the match and won Lazio only a second Scudetto. The evil Turin Empire was defeated, Rome could celebrate again. Well, at least half of it could. When 2000 started, everything was going quite well for Roma. They were deep into a UEFA Cup run, had a Coppa Italia campaign still worth fighting for, and Champions League qualification for the first time since its rebranding was a very real possibility. Then Cagliari and Leeds United knocked them out of cup contention, and 4 defeats from 5 league games in February and March transformed a season previously thought of as quite solid into an utter mess. The last of those defeats against Lazio, you know, that game that finished 2-1 that we literally just got done speaking about, was the last time Roma would be defeated that season, yet somehow the campaign went and got even worse. They didn't lose in their last 7 fixtures, sure, but they drew 6 of them. The gap to Inter ultimately was 4 points. Vincenzo Montella had looked a good acquisition from Sampdoria. Francesco Totti was coming to the boil, and Fabio Capello was a very decent manager with a nice new 3 at the back system. It should have been better than this, 6th place in the league and nowhere in the cups. The summer did the club the world of good. Capello was kept on, despite all Italian tradition pointing towards an itchy trigger finger and a sacking. Francesco Totti had lit up Euro 2000, even if Italy were cruelly robbed of a second European Championship. And what's more, Roma were insatiably active in the transfer market. Totti had left for the summer's tournament with a broken and dejected squad. He came back home with a new lease on life. Adding to the previous splashes in the market of Montella and Nakata, Roma had prized Gabriel Batistuta from Fiorentina, as well as Walter Samuel, Jonathan Zabina and Emerson, without losing any key players in return. Add to them a collection of players that included World Cup winners Cafu and Vincent Candela, and the Euro 2000 final goalscorer Marco Del Vecchio, and Roma suddenly had quite the team. They couldn't, could they? The romantic side to Roma fans thought, why not? Whilst the realistic side, as viewed through their very own real vision of an instant Coppa Italia demise to Atalanta before the season even started, screamed, don't be so fucking stupid. A league season that was due to begin in October hadn't even begun, and Roma Ultras were already calling for the heads of their players and manager. Presumably, Lazio's heroics of the prior season hadn't helped matters whatsoever. Then the shape clicked. Batigol was prolific, netting his first Serie A hat-trick for the Giallorosso on what I'd call bonfire night. Francesco Totti was pulling the strings, Emerson was dynamic in midfield, and the incredible Cafu was hurtling up and down the right-hand side. In the first half of the season, however, they hadn't been able to lay a glove on either Milan team, going down to losses in the San Siro against both the Nerazzurri and the Rossoneri. Whilst they hadn't scored against Juve in the final game of 2000, Capello's side had kept a clean sheet, which was enough to make Roma the winter champions. Whilst they'd not beaten the best that the league had to offer traditionally, they had taken down some big forces. Battigo's late winner had broken Fiorentina hearts in November, whilst an own goal settled the Derby della Capitale in Roma's favour a month on. Once their European exit was confirmed across two brilliant legs against Liverpool, Roma's minds were focused on the Scudetto. And it is here, inside of a 7-match winning run between January and March, where the title picture was changed drastically. It started with a comprehensive thrashing of Napoli in January, but took in vital away triumphs in Parma and Bologna, as well as an equally tense victory at home to Lecce, thanks to Walter Samuel's second-half winner. They left it late in their next 3 matches, waiting until the 80th minute to sink Vicenza, finding a crucial winner at home to Inter on 86 minutes before turning the screw against Brescia with 20 minutes left on the clock. Each of those 3 wins could be attributed to Vincenzo Montella and his 5 goals across the 3 fixtures. Initially, Marco Del Vecchio had been preferred by Fabio Capello for his relentlessness and industry. The more the season went on, the more it became vastly important, however. The scavenger Montella was preferred, and he repaid his manager in spades. Whilst the stalemate away to Regina ended the winning run, Roma had to be back to their best to grind out another late win at home, this time to Hellas Verona, and thanks once again to goals from Montella and Battigol. Fiorentina would get their revenge on Battistuta the following weekend in Florence in a 3-1 victory, Roma's 3rd league defeat all season, when it came on April the 9th. It would be their last. Yet Roma fans had experienced this the prior season, a defeat in April being their last, only for the final 7 or 8 matches to be drawn and the season to end in capitulation. Here, whilst Roma weren't as efficient in turning draws into wins, they leant back on their character to carve out the points. They forced an own goal at home to Perugia 5 days after their loss in Florence to snatch a point from the jaws of defeat, whilst they suffered a gut punch in the 5th minute of added time in the derby in late April. Stoppage time proved Roma's the subsequent weekend when Vincenzo Montella snatched himself a late equaliser in Turin against Juve. To fall 2 goals behind inside of 6 minutes to the team of Zidane and Del Piero and still find the requisite resolve to return to parity was ultimately the match which created champions out of those Roma players. They rebounded with wins over Atalanta and Bari before another crucial Montella goal snatched a point against Milan. It was necessary, especially as Juventus just kept winning. The old lady had stumbled out of the traps in the earlier part of the season, but now were relentless in chasing down Roma. Since their 2-2 draw with the Giallorossi in early May, Juve had cut a 6-point deficit down to just 2. Given that Roma had a far from comfortable match with 4th place Parma to come, and since Juve could always find a bit of luck or a bribe in the business end of the season wasn't over just yet. With memories of 1981 presumably still fresh, there was probably quite a sizable portion of the Roma faithful going into the final day with trepidation that they could actually win a 3rd Scudetto. But the match in front of almost 75,000 Romanisti in the Olimpico couldn't have started much better. First half goals from Francesco Totti and Vincenzo Montella settled the nerves that couldn't be altered by Juventus' winning scoreline at home to Atalanta. All Roma had to do was hold their nerve, and when Battistuta netted a 3rd with 12 minutes to go, the Giallorossi were certain that they were champions, and they were. The capital had waited a generation for a champion and had got 2 in 2 years. Here in our present day, that wait for another Roman champion has returned to the same breadth of time. Since 1992, Milan and Juventus had controlled Serie A, but for 2 brief years things were slightly different. Since the first years of the 21st century, however, things have returned to a more traditional keel. Lazio tried to usurp Roma by spending more money, more than ever before, on players, but of decreasing quality. Gaisca Mendieta was one more, Hernan Crespo arguably 2, but enormous sums were thrown at players like Claudio Lopez and Angelo Peruzzi, as well as both Dino Baggio and Karol Poborski, despite all being well past their sell-by date. Key talent in Nedved and Nesta departed without being properly replaced before Sven-Goran Eriksson resigned midway through the 2000-2001 season, with the carrot of the England job dangling in front of him. It only got worse from there. Sergio Cragnotti wound up in prison, having spent his own and others' money like mad. His creative accountancy had landed him behind bars, and after diddling pensioners out of 1.2 billion euros worth of savings, it reflected on his football team. They wobbled drastically, teetered on the brink like so many had done before them. However, they soon stabilised to return back to the fold of the elite Italian Calcio, even if they have yet to mount a true title challenge since 2000. Comparatively, Roma were flying and would finish second in 6 of the 9 seasons that followed their third Scudetto title. This achievement was only inflated by the fact that the Giallorossi were the only major club not to be tarred by Calciopoli. Another enormous factor, naturally, was Francesco Totti. He could have left for Real Madrid at the height of his fame, but a combination of poor performances and bad headlines from major tournaments put an end to his Ballon d'Or campaign and a potential move to Real Madrid. He would later cushion the blow by stating that 1 title in Rome was worth more than 10 in Madrid. He was one of the last stars remaining for Roma as the 2000s ended. In a tale as old as time, Roma had overfaced themselves. Capello left in 2004 and President Franco Sensi had to flog the family silver because the club couldn't afford the players' wages. What could have been a spiralling down the drain exercise was caught by Luciano Spalletti. He was the man to tactically renovate Roma, and a tactical overhaul that placed Totti front and centre in an innovative 4-6-0 formation led the club back to the heights, not only back home but in Europe as well. They would ultimately fall short on both fronts and are now 16 years without a trophy and 7 years without being in contention for a league title. Even if you were to count Cagliari as a southern team, you could still count the amount of southern clubs to have won the Serie A on one hand. Yet even in this country where its footballing powers is so concentrated to the north, the capital was allowed to shine for a hectic couple of years, and it should rightly be celebrated as the accomplishment it was in this era, particularly the era of Football Italia. Rome is by far the weakest Italian city when it comes to football, weaker even than Naples, especially when they had Maradona in their squad. The proof is in this video here. Click on it.